Welcome to the Comfy Chairs. I'm Kate, and today we're going to focus on how we can make the workplace better for everyone. So please have a seat and join the conversation. We're here talking today about trauma-informed workplaces, and I have a wonderful guest with me, Stephanie, whom I will allow to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm so thrilled to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat
Yay.
with you and chat with your listeners about my work. I'll give you I call it Cliff Notes version of
Mm-hmm.
me. My name's Stephanie Lemick. I live in Phoenix, Arizona with my husband, my dogs, and my two stepdaughters, teenage stepdaughters. And I've spent my entire career, since I graduated from college as an HR professional. I've worked in really big companies. I've been an HR team of one, and I love the work I do because I really love that kind of magic when you're able to support individuals and also support company goals, missions, objectives, which I think kind of leads well into my work I'm doing right now, which I'm very passionate about. I am the founder of an organization called the Wounded Workforce, and our goal is to build trauma informed workplaces. 70% of US adults self identify as having one or more traumatic experience in their lifetimes. So, this is something that is impacting our corporate environments, our organizations, our teams. And when we normalize the conversation, when we drive awareness and education about what trauma is and how we can better support folks, we just create better workplaces for everyone, regardless of their trauma status. And I've personally found, as a seasoned HR practitioner, a lot of the things that are hot buttons or worry us about the workplace of the future, so to speak, they're actually directly addressed by trauma informed work or trauma informed cultures.
Trauma is one of those terms that I think kind of either galvanizes or divides people. And I think it's very important for us to start with what do we mean when we say trauma? And what then, by extension, do we mean when we talk about a trauma informed environment? So,
Amazing.
yeah, I know
Yeah,
you have a definition that you've
I
shared
do.
with me.
I do, and it's so important. I mean, you hit on something that's absolutely a hot button of mine. When I say the word trauma or anyone says the word trauma, you get so many different responses and
Yeah,
ideas. I mean, you get folks who think about trauma and they think about, individuals who have been in active war zones, and that's
exactly.
the only person they kind of identify and think about. And certainly those individuals may have experienced trauma, but it can be so much more than that as well. And then on the flip side, Gen Z is so comfortable using the term trauma, almost overusing the word trauma. And so it
Yes.
becomes more of this colloquial phrase versus what it really is. And so I absolutely love to start any of my work talking about, hey, what's our shared definition? So, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, originated the concept of trauma informed care a little over 20 years ago. And so, because so much of my work is based on this amazing work by SAMHSA, I like to use their definition of trauma as a place to start, because I think it is easy to understand, but it also creates enough space for the variety of experiences that can show up in traumatic experiences. So, the definition of trauma we'll use is trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life threatening and that has lasting effects on functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well being, or in the case of the workplace, performance. And it's a big, broad definition, a lot of words. So, what I always like to tell people to remember are the three E's: event, experience, and then effects when you think about trauma. And that can, it really can encompass a lot when you look at that definition. And there are a lot of different experiences of trauma, and individuals have very different responses to different events. So that's why it's so helpful to have those three E's, because you may just think of a singular event and think this is traumatic or not traumatic. But that experience and effects is going to be so individual and really informed by prior experiences in someone's life as well.
Yeah, it's a very easy to grasp definition. It's something happens. As an individual, I have a response to it. And then those two things together then have a lasting effect on me.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it clearer that it doesn't have to be, I survived, hand to hand combat in a war zone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are things like natural disasters for some
Yes.
people.
Pandemics.
The pandemic is a phenomenal example to look at when we think about traumatic experiences, because here's something we all experience. We all experience the pandemic. However, everyone kind of had their own experience nestled into that same shared experience. And everyone had very different effects. I mean, some people lost loved ones, and then others, sure, they worked from home, or couldn't go out to eat, but relatively,
Yeah.
in the grand scheme, not nearly as impactful as maybe some others. So you have these wide ranges of experiences in the same event. I love that example, because I mean, we all understand it pretty intimately at this point.
We all know people that had, a quote unquote easy pandemic, and then people for whom it was life altering, because no two people had the same experience. I'm seeing trauma informed, really, there seems to be a surge in the conversation about it. The easy logic to me is that recovering from the pandemic, that's why the conversation is much more active. Why do you think it's something that's showing up in the literature, in social media, all the places?
All the places. I think you have one piece of it absolutely correct. In fact, just a few days ago, Harvard Business Review published an article, what are the 4 things that are going to change the workplace the most? And absolutely, number 1, the way we approach and relate to work as a society is shifting drastically. So Harvard Business Review pointed to that. I would say that it is a great summation of all of the things that were kind of packed into our experiences over the last 3 years. We are watching traumas play out in front of us almost constantly. Right now, we're seeing what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and that is kind of, it's hard to avoid, even if you want to. There is this fabulous quote about when we watch trauma, when we're constantly surrounded by trauma and think we're not affected by it, even if it's not our personal experience, it's like standing in a rainstorm and thinking you're not going to get wet.
We're wired for empathy. Mirror neurons fire when we see pain, when we see joy. Of course, seeing someone suffer, for healthy people, who have normal psychology, it's going to have an impact on us. And it doesn't mean that our lives are altered to the same extent, but there is now a mark on our psyche as a result of it.
Other thing I think that's driving trauma-informed workplaces, because I don't want to miss out on this, because I think it's really important. Gen Z. I picked on Gen Z a little bit up front because they're a little more colloquial with the term trauma, but they're also really a lot more comfortable bringing their full self, genuine self to work and talking about traumatic experiences. And sooner rather than later, Gen Z is actually going to make up well over half of the working adults in the US. So that was another thing, actually, the Harvard Business Review article pointed to. They called it the youth quake, Gen Z entering the workforce. And their expectations about work are so different. And I think for millennials, I think for, my generation, our generation, the way we related to expectations around organizations addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion I think that's the way Gen Z is going to relate to mental health at work, wellness at work, trauma
Hmm.
informed workplaces, however you want to kind of frame it. I think it's a really important demand that we're
Hmm.
going to see Gen Z kind of bring with them to the workplace. So I think those two things
Yeah.
together are really what's driving this. This is the moment to finally have these conversations.
I believe that this is the direction that we were headed
Yeah.
prior to 2020. What the pandemic did, for a lot of reasons, is it accelerated these changes that were coming, not
Mhm.
just in terms of the experience of trauma, but the workforce expecting different. Because
Yes.
we saw something very different happen during that time, and it opened up the avenue to start making changes. And it concerns me. This is probably a different topic for a different day, but as a former HR person, it concerns me to see so many employers trying to kind of forcibly revert back. And I think we're poised for some unpleasant surprises on that
I
front.
do too. I do too. I do too. To not totally derail our conversation, I agree. We could probably have a whole nother conversation on this.
That's the
Is
next time you come on the
yes.
podcast.
I think when it comes to what we all experienced in the pandemic around work and how it fits into our lives, I'm a big believer that the whole like work life boundary didn't ever really exist very well. And
Yes.
I think, like the jig is up. We know that the way our lives and work are intertwined, it's just different now, and
Yeah.
people recognize that. And my dad says this all the time, and I actually think it's really good. You can't unring that bell. Like
Yes.
the bell rang, we all know, like you can't kind of shove something back in the box. I think those organizations and those leaders who really chafe to get things back to the way they were are missing out on a ton of opportunity to make things better than they were.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you. I want to rein both of us back in to go back to that workplace. And
Yes.
I have a wonderful quote that will probably be familiar to you, ma'am, uh, around this topic that I think is a good entry point that reinforces the conversation about trauma. And it is trauma informed workplaces don't replace mental health care or seek to diagnose or treat trauma. They only seek to support in the context of the workplace. And those great words are from a post that you made on Friday on LinkedIn. And I thought, wonderful timing. I can steal that to kind of enter this conversation that I get to have with you a few days after. So,
Amazing.
yeah. So tell us more about that it's not about coming in and being the mental health provider, it's about support.
Yeah, it's so important to me. And maybe it's my many years in the corporate environment, many years in HR as a recovery HR person. You can probably relate, Kate. Uh, I want to make it really, really explicit and clear what trauma informed workplaces are not, because this is something that if misused, I think can be harmful. And one of the number one things you're doing with the trauma informed workplace is looking to mitigate harm. So I would really say number one, top priority is that organizations seeking to be trauma informed understand that they are never seeking to diagnose or treating employee trauma. And I think of that because, we can all kind of make assumptions and take guesses about what someone's experience may or may not be. The truth is, though, we are not credentialed professionals in this space. There are amazing people who dedicate their lives and have years and years of education. Another piece of this I think is really important, and I want to be more effusive than I have been. I actually had a great conversation recently with Catherine Manning, who is a phenomenal expert in this space. And we talked a little bit about how people can kind of interact and chat with people who have traumatic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And we are both firm believers that survivors' stories belong to them. So it's important that we are not asking people to disclose their trauma in a way that is coercive or in a way they are feeling forced to share previous traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
Who, what, where, when, how, and if they disclose their traumatic experiences at all, should 100% always be up to that
Hmm.
individual. And so trauma informed workplaces should not be a situation where you're like calling your employees in and saying, let's, have a cup of coffee and tell me about all of your trauma. It's not about that.
Oh,
Like,
one
can you
cup of coffee
imagine?
wouldn't do it. No, unfortunately I can. And I think that's the knife edge that employers are going to have to walk right now,
Yes.
is that establishing the policies and practices necessary to be a trauma informed workplace is not about storytelling. Essentially, it's how am I managing performance in a way that recognizes the full person who may have trauma in their lives. And whether or not they do is not my concern, but the human care of my people, so that they are able to perform their jobs to the best of their abilities, because we're at work, that's the priority.
And that's the thing. Trauma informed workplaces are about creating awareness, like we said, to that existence, that prevalence of trauma, and then looking to actively avoid re traumatizing survivors of trauma or triggering a trauma survivor, to use some more common language we hear. And then we want to avoid creating new traumatic experiences. I mean, I certainly know from my experience years in HR, yes, people experience trauma in the workplace, but since
Mm-hmm.
I've started doing this work, oh, holy buckets, people have traumatic experiences from their workplaces. And the idea is to really think about our structure, our processes, our culture, our management style, how we approach that. So we are trauma informed. So
Mm-hmm.
our actions we take, again, are avoiding re-traumatizing survivors and avoiding creating new trauma. That's really the heart of trauma-informed workplaces. It's not treatment. It's not, let's dig in deep and work through trauma. It is about supports. And those supports are really important when it comes to someone's healing journey, even if those supports are just a place where they know they're safe and they aren't going to be triggered or be traumatized.
So this wonderful, like, past, present, future model. When people come to work for us, we acknowledge that they have a past. They bring their whole self. And it's, what are we doing that we're not causing further harm, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual? Then what are we doing going forward to avoid trauma and harm? If the policies and structure, the support, the organizational design takes those things into account, well, that would be great.
Yeah. And I mean, what's so great too is I think everyone, regardless of trauma status, benefits from a trauma informed workplace
Yeah.
because these structures, again, it's not about, treatment or, let's all sit together in a kumbaya circle and like talk about our trauma. I think that's a misperception that's out there. It's really about culture, systems, and processes, which is, probably a little less sexy to talk about, but I think it's also the most transformative and impactful.
Those are the boundaries for an employer as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Now, you educated me earlier on the principles of a trauma informed workplace outlined by SAMHSA. I think it's important to discuss them. And then
Absolutely.
I would like your opinion about what you have seen be most effective in applying those principles.
Absolutely. So SAMHSA originated the principles of trauma informed care. And so the work I've done has piggybacked heavily from the
Mm-hmm.
work of SAMHSA around trauma informed care. And I've interpreted those principles to be applicable to any kind of workplace environment. So the 7 principles are: safety is the first one. So safety includes physical safety. So your physical person, your body is safe from any type of harm. That includes psychological safety, and then
Yes.
also includes financial safety, which is an interesting one. I
Yeah.
could probably talk for hours on that one and why it's so important. Next is trust and transparency. Third is community, and community is based on SAMHSA's principle of peer support. Next is collaboration. And collaboration, gosh, we talk about collaboration at work all the time. But when we look at collaboration as it relates to a trauma-informed workplace, one thing we really zero in on, because of course we're looking at systems and processes, is power dynamics, power
Yeah.
imbalances, positional power. It's been long been a hot button of mine. So really understanding how organizational structures, how different, departments or function events, how, different relationships create power imbalances. And at the root of, almost every traumatic experience is an imbalance of power. And so really recognizing and mitigating power imbalances and the misuse of power is so important. And that nests into that principle of collaboration.
I was able to tune in for your panel yesterday,
Oh,
and
amazing.
that was very enlightening to me to hear that when we talk about collaboration in this context, it's not necessarily about the product, it's about how are we creating balance so that the
Yes.
dynamic can be effective to get the work done. Yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you.
That panel was amazing. Like I'm always over the moon. My panelists are so kind and brilliant. So I'm so glad you were able to catch that. The next principle is empowerment. And this one probably makes a lot of sense. We've talked about, a
Hmm.
sense of powerlessness, things like that when it comes to trauma. So empowerment is huge. And I like to look at empowerment in four different pieces when we think about it as in a trauma informed culture. So there's choice. It doesn't mean unlimited choices, that your strengths are leveraged in the workplace. You're recognized for your work and your contributions. And last but certainly not least, is you have an opportunity to grow. And so those four things are so important for every person as part of an organization.
That way of talking about empowerment dovetails really beautifully with Daniel Pink's definition of motivation. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose are what you need to provide the circumstances for motivation. And empowering people, giving them that autonomy is key to that. And choice, recognition, bringing what it is that'll let you master the task at hand. Yeah, those fit beautifully together. And for an employer, empowering your people is a way to motivate.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes people like to use the term ownership. Like I want my team to take more ownership. Ownership and empowerment are allies here. If you want to drive ownership on your team, empowerment, those four things are an amazing way to accomplish that. The next principle is humility and responsiveness. No one gets everything right all the time. Things evolve and change. So, humility and responsiveness, I especially love because it allows these cultural principles or processes to be evergreen because there's a mechanism to say, hey, this isn't quite right anymore, or maybe it never was. And being, open, transparent about that. Employee listening is going to be really important here. So, having your employees have a clear voice, being open and receptive to that feedback is going to be huge. And the last principle, and certainly not least, is cultural, historical, and gender issues. Some people may be familiar with the concept of generational trauma, how trauma is passed down. Most of us, if not familiar with that, are familiar with the fact that things that were put in place years and years ago, slavery, redlining, those things have lasting impacts. So without having a lens to consider that, to consider those important individual aspects people are bringing with them to the workplace, we're not going to be able to fully recognize an individual. And that's really what's important and what we want to be able to do.
One thing you talked about You talked about employee listening, like listening to employees and making certain that their voices are heard. My employee engagement experience popped up, and it made me think about listening strategies.
Yes.
And that made me think about application of these principles. What are a few ways that any leader, regardless of the size of their team or their type of organization, they could very easily start applying the principles?
I think, first of all, the best thing to do with these principles is look at them and look at what you're already doing. I mean, I give this advice to anyone that's doing any kind of, cultural um, audit, or anyone even doing like an employee engagement survey action plan. Don't overlook what you're already doing and what you're doing well, so you can maintain that, because that's something that already exists within your culture. And it can be something not only to keep doing, but it also can be a springboard for you to build upon. More likely than not, you will be hitting on one of two places that I think is really important. And I think you can take action relatively easily compared to some of the others. So empowerment, we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Empowerment is, it's meaty. It gets to a lot of what we're doing. It also has a lot of benefits that are proven, because you're looking for ways to create strengths leverage. So folks are going to be more engaged. I'm a big fan of Clifton Strengths, or Strengths Finder by Gallup. It is an amazing way to motivate a team, get a team working together well. And wowza, it also taps right into strengths leveraged as an item of empowerment. And then when it comes to choice with empowerment, maybe this is me just oversimplifying, but my advice I love to give to managers, so if they could do one thing, they don't have to make any investment, they could do tomorrow, is every time they're working with their team members, ask yourself, how can I make this a choice for my team? And again, it doesn't have to be, hey, the world is your oyster, do whatever you want. It can be as simple as, hey, there are these two projects. Is there one you prefer? Hey, here's the objective. I'm going to give you the choice on how you get to that outcome. So it really kind of works against, the typical micromanagement. So
Mm-hmm.
empowerment's a beautiful place to start, because I think a lot of organizations are already doing some of this really well, or more open or interested in investing here, because there's so much overlap with some of the other benefits these things have in terms of employee engagement, productivity, business results.
You're right. That is an easy, no to low cost approach. You're heading toward the tail end of the year. I'm imagining that a manager could very easily make a small investment, get themselves the strength-based leadership, and then
Yes.
you can spend the new year talking about how can we make use of, your learning strength or your wow, and
Mhm.
that way you are recognizing, you're leveraging, and you're making the strength the choice for them as
Right.
well.
And you're growing them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we think about growth so often when we talk about work as, I'm getting promoted. And
Yes.
sure, yeah, that's absolutely a way we grow. Not
Uh-huh.
everyone wants to get promoted, and that's okay. We can grow in so many other ways, and tools like StrengthsFinder, again, are amazing for that, because with that small investment, Gallup provides all these tools and resources, so you
Mm-hmm.
can really effectively take action here and continue to take action and make it evergreen. So strengths is probably one of my favorite tools as it relates to trauma informed workplaces.
It's so good. It's just so good. I can't say enough about the strengths, material, the concepts, and there's so many ways to make use of it
Yes.
too. Yeah, that's our third
Oh
podcast,
yeah,
Stephanie. Is you'll come back
we
and we'll talk
should.
about.
It'd be amazing.
We'll
I
just.
also want to say, if organizations feel really happy with where they are with empowerment, which I could see really being the case
Mhm.
for an organization that's very invested in their people and processes, because aspects of empowerment are something that ideally organizations would already be investing in. The other place I would really go to next is safety, because
Okay.
safety is so foundational.
Hmm.
And safety, again, is physical safety. Physical safety is super important. If you do not feel physically safe at work, holy bananas, how are you supposed to do anything else? We have to remember to think about safety holistically. So, safety also needs to encompass psychological safety. And it's kind of a hot, sexy thing to talk about. So,
It
there's a
is.
lot of great resources around it. Psychological safety is going to have a lot to do with your managers and leaders. And we know managers and leaders need more support, resources, and training here. Google's Project Aristotle actually has amazing resources as it relates to
Yeah.
how to build psychological safety on a team. It also has great research and information about the amazing impact that psychological safety has on team outcomes as well. So, again, we're getting to something that's super foundational for a trauma informed workplace that has resources available regardless of budget, and also has data for those skeptics. And then lastly, financial safety. And I want to highlight a little bit of this here. A lot of organizations actually do a really great job with financial safety. And I would say, especially, the typical like white collar corporate jobs. Financial safety is looking at, a livable wage. It is looking at, are you providing a 401k? Are you providing for additional support? So someone feels like financially safe and secure. One of my favorite companies, I learned about this year, they're called North Star Financial.
Hmm.
They do budgeting services for organizations, and they will help with everything from, big financial planner retirement stuff to helping people budget for like their first couch. I have to say though, trauma informed workplaces aren't just for white collar employees. So trauma informed workplaces should be
Yes.
everyone. And so if you're interested in building a trauma informed workplace and you're not providing financial safety, you've got a really big issue that you need to take a look at. And as we look at the level of income inequality in our society, financial safety is a big concern. So organizations that are interested in this, looking at safety, really need to think about livable wages,
Hmm.
the frequency they're scheduling their employees' access to benefits
Yeah.
as well, because that is financial safety is so huge in terms of
Hmm.
any kind of, safe environment. It's so important when it comes to trauma recovery, that those safety aspects really bleed into our lives outside of work more than I think any of the other principles. So I think, again, in terms of the scale of impact, that's another one that's just super important to zero in on if you're looking to start your journey or build on your existing work for a trauma informed culture.
Yeah, I want to be clear too. When we talk about financial safety, it's not that we're saying everybody gets a raise,
Right.
right?
100%. Yes.
Even something like, do my attendance policies inadvertently penalize people that don't have a car? They don't have
Yes.
access to reliable transportation. The employee that's having to catch the bus and is dependent upon the bus being on time to be on time to work, are they being punished for that and possibly losing their job because of that? Or
Right.
am I aware that there may be circumstances beyond that individual's control? And it's not that I'm, making exceptions or displaying favoritism. One of the things I've heard that I've extrapolated in this conversation is that so much of trauma informed work is about creating the experience of being seen and heard.
Yes.
And that's a perfect example. Joe is late repeatedly, not because he's a ne'er do well, but because the bus route's unreliable. And what are we doing to accommodate that as long as performance is not an issue?
Yeah.
I think are the
And,
types
and
of questions you can ask yourself in leadership.
and early in my career, I worked in organizations where there were employees that were reliant on public transportation
Hmm.
or reliant on, things that weren't reliable. And then we would blanket have these attendance policies,
Yep.
and it's it's no good for anyone. It's not good for an organization that has to continually hire and train new employees. It's
Mhm.
not good for the individual who is trying, but for reasons out of their own control, they are unable to meet, a certain requirement. It's not good for society.
Mhm.
When we have someone, like honestly, if there is someone who is trying as hard as they can to work, to contribute, to take care of themselves, their family, their loved ones, don't we want to find ways to help them do that?
Well, I also think about the heart, like the heart of leaders that are
Yeah.
having to enforce things that cause harm to
Yes,
people. That has an impact on them as
it
well. And
does.
do you want to be a leader that's demonstrating love for your people, um, by seeing, by acknowledging their challenges, or do you want to lead in a way that's essentially heartless? And that's one of the decisions I think leaders have to make in this space of, am I demonstrating love for the people or no?
I it's so important. And I would tell you that right there, what you said, it's a lot of the reason why I'm not an in-house HR professional anymore. And I
Yeah.
would warn a guest that if you talk to a lot of HR professionals, especially who have, either changed jobs or changed careers or gone independent over the course of the last 3 years, that's part of why
Mm-hmm.
is you get to a point where you're like, I don't know if the systems, the behaviors that I'm upholding internally, I don't feel good about them
Yeah.
anymore.
I left what I think of as straight human resources.
Yeah.
They can't see my air quotes. Um, After the recession in 2008, I recognized at that time that being the person responsible for being the agent of the organization
Yeah.
during layoffs, it it was draining. I couldn't do it
Yes.
anymore. And there are so many caring, dedicated human resources professionals that are able to do that type of work every day. I could not. I needed to be able to turn my focus toward support and growth. So yeah, it's HR is hard, hard work. It is not for the faint of heart.
It is. And so actually, one of the things I talk about is compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. We talked
Mm-hmm.
about it a little bit at the beginning of our conversation. How do you expect to not get wet when you're,
Yes.
surrounded by all of this? A lot of HR professionals, I really think, who experience, I think we say burnout, but really, I think what it was for many of us was secondary trauma.
Yeah.
And secondary trauma is trauma. It
Mm-hmm.
does create that psychological harm. And we think about it a lot when we think about first responders, when we think about, medical professionals, sometimes even we think about teachers, especially during the pandemic. Secondary trauma can come up in any workplace. It's what are you constantly kind of inundated with? And it's a real issue. And it's important to consider that as well, because trauma informed workplaces obviously want to mitigate secondary trauma because that is a traumatic experience.
We do have all types of people in customer facing, consumer facing roles who are hurting because of the way they're being treated.
Work has to change.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, I wish I had thought of this myself. An amazing executive coach actually said it to me, and it stuck with me. And I believe it firmly. Work is one of the places where we're still all kind of able to work together and achieve a common goal, find common ground. And in a world where that is less and less likely in other spaces, I think the workplace has a special opportunity to not only make work better, but also make our world better and make our experiences better. Work is such a vital aspect of so many parts of our lives. Sure, we're all kind of chafing at how work has been defined
Yeah.
and where it's been in our lives. I think that actually makes it an amazing opportunity to be something even more than it's been in the past, and be a real catalyst for positive societal change.
Yeah. Uh, Stephanie, that's amazing. I'm on board. It really, it's
Woo!
because you're exactly right. Some people have a calling to do something. Some people have that vocation where they've been called into a field. Some people are very passionate, but at the end of the day, it is part of the human experience to work. Because we share that, it is a way for us to set aside so many other differences because it's core to who we are. So why wouldn't we turn to the workplace to make things better for all of us? Something that keeps cropping up in my mind, Maslow's hierarchy, because I think the principles definitely sort of echo. You start with safety, that physical self, and then can you work your way up through advancing growth, belonging, to get to a place of that self-actualization and fulfillment.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
the principles of trauma-informed care and work, we'll say, and Maslow, those concepts, they give us a beautiful roadmap to get there.
Absolutely. And they are so interconnected.
Yes.
Whenever, I'm having a panel discussion or a conversation, I'm usually referencing like 3 or 4 principles because they're so interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. If nothing else, if you're in charge of processes, if you're thinking about culture, if you're, considering, systems, policies for your organization, maybe print out the 7 principles of trauma informed care. I made what I think is kind of a cute little graphic.
It is.
Nothing groundbreaking, but
It's
it's
a
cute.
very nice graphic. It is. It's very pleasant and pleasing to the eye. And I will make certain that it's linked as well because I want people to see it.
Thank you. But print it out and look at it when you're making decisions and ask yourself each of those lens. What's the lens of safety as it relates to this?
Mm-hmm.
How can I think about how this, is either a plus or minus to the team member's safety? Same with trust and transparency, same with community, same with collaboration, empowerment, humility and responsiveness, cultural, historical, and gender issues. Again, this is something you can do, take half an hour as you're thinking about a project, as you're thinking about a choice as a leader, and consider that. I won't say it's free because it does cost you some time, but I think having just these principles, these ideas as a lens to consider the impact of our action is a powerful tool in its own right as well.
I love your piece of advice for leaders. And I love that you already gave it because that was going to be one of my questions for you was what's your advice? And it's ask yourself, how can I make this a choice?
Yeah.
And that one act, making that a habit that you have, opens the door for, well, I've made a choice. Is it now safe for that person, to do the thing that they've chosen? Is it going to, create belonging? Is there an opportunity for collaboration? Can it be done in community?
Yeah.
That it's a wonderful springboard from I'm going to empower my people to opening up all of the other aspects.
It is. And it's so nice because I think it's relatively easy to do. Like you have to remind yourself to do it, but just how can I make this a choice? Just every time, like, how can I make this a choice? Can I make this a choice? How? And I think it's nice because a lot of times we ask leaders to do kind of hard stuff when we ask them to model behaviors that support well-being or mental health or trauma-informed workplaces. And a lot of times, leaders have to think about what their leaders expect. So we're asking leaders maybe to, hey, be vulnerable. Well, maybe they're existing in an environment where they don't feel like it's safe to be vulnerable. I bet they exist in an environment where they can find a way to create a choice for their team, though.
Yeah.
So, or maybe someone's just not ready to be vulnerable. They don't know how. That doesn't feel genuine to them at this point in their lives. That's okay too. I bet you can find a way to create a choice for your team, though, in a way that's genuine and meets who you are. Because I think sometimes when we ask people, it gets back to that whole, I feel very strongly about this. We don't ask people to disclose stories, experiences of trauma. Those stories are up to them. It's their choice. I think it's the same with vulnerability. I think vulnerability is so powerful,
Yeah, I
but it's
agree.
not powerful when it's forced because it's not
No,
real. It's not genuine.
no,
And it kind of it steals away power from individuals when they feel forced to disclose something that they're not comfortable with.
no, exactly. Well, again, what I love about how can I make this a choice, it also, at the end of the day, it's going to make that manager's life easier because
Yes.
you're giving the work to the employee in its
Mhm.
fullness that way. So a little bit of mental effort, that small investment is going to ease the burden of leadership.
Yes.
Who doesn't want that, right?
100%. And it's also a great tool to like get out of your own way if you struggle with micromanagement, because inherently when you're trying to provide choice, that is that's working straight against micromanagement for you. So again, and a reminder, it does not mean you have to provide all of the options. Choice is as simple as this or that, and that still counts.
Stephanie, I love how you are able to get to a place where it's simple acts. Because again, we started, trauma is a concept and an experience that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it can be very daunting to think,
Mm.
should I be doing this? Should I think about my leadership in this way? And rather than trying to tackle trauma, the event, the experience, the effect, it's something as little as, before I make an assignment, how can I make this a choice? How easy is that?
And that's what trauma informed workplaces are. Is it's here's this big hairy challenge that we face as a society, as a culture. So many of us have these traumatic experiences we're carrying with us. And a lot of us don't even realize how they're showing up for us at work.
This is
And
true.
all I want to do is say, hey, managers, hey, leaders, hey, HR professionals, hey, team members, why don't you think about a handful of these things? And they also benefit a whole lot of other stuff in the workplace in terms of engagement, business results.
Yes.
But just think about it. And in doing that, you are actually, I would say, you're avoiding re traumatization. But more than that, I feel like in a lot of ways, you can actually be actively supporting someone's journey
Hmm.
to recover from experiences of trauma.
Yeah.
Because think about that. Someone in your life is always making sure that you have a choice.
Yeah.
Think about how powerful that is to someone who's experienced a lack of choices or even a lack of good choices in their life and is
Hmm.
dealing with that. Instead, they work with a manager who always looks for a way to find them a choice. That is, I mean, that simple thing, without even you knowing that background or history, that can absolutely be an amazing contribution to an individual's career, but also their life overall.
Yeah. Yeah. When we had our prep time, something I wrote something down that you said that day that has been central to how I've been thinking about today's conversation. Um, and you said that this work, the reason that you're so passionate about this is it's a way to make workplaces better for everybody.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I hear. I think you've laid out again a really clear roadmap for how we can do that, um, as leaders, as employees, as employers, and it feels very good to be having this conversation, to think about how we could change the world through work.
Yeah. And I think we can.
Hmm.
I think this is the moment. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier. I think people are more willing to talk about it now for whatever reason. And I think this is the moment. I think
Hmm.
we're ready for a change. I think there are demographic shifts in the workplace that mean a change has to happen. We're kind of
Agreed.
beyond a place where the status quo will work. And I also think I think about my experience as an HR professional. I think about experiences, managers, and leaders. And oftentimes things feel very disjointed. There are all these kind of like bolted on answers to all these different problems. And it's confusing
Mm-hmm.
and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And what I love about trauma informed cultures is hey, yeah, it's a lot. I won't pretend that it's, hey, do this one thing and all your problems are solved. It's no magic pill. Because cultural change is hard, and anyone who tells you it's not is lying to you.
They are so
But
lying. Yes.
they're lying if they're like, oh, we'll change your culture in 6 months. They've lied to you. Congratulations.
Six
Um,
years, maybe.
there you go. Now they're telling the truth. But it's these 7 things that you can think about. Maybe you don't think about all 7 at one time. Maybe you think about 2 or 3 and you iterate and you get better, but it's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So your leaders are thinking about these 7 principles or whatever principle you want to focus on. And it's like, how can we think about empowerment? How can we think about collaboration? How can we do this over and over? And so there's this guiding principle for your managers and leaders to consider versus 9 different things that they're supposed to do to
Yes.
check the boxes to be a good manager. And so I like that as well.
That's one of the things in how we prepare and position managers of people, that we treat all the stuff like it's extra work. And
Yes.
it's not. Like the
So,
relationship, the thought that goes into the work, the the stuff is the work, right? Engagement, performance management, feedback. That's your job as a manager. And we've got to start integrating those asks of leaders
yes.
into the flow of their work as opposed to treating
Yes.
it like one more thing. Um,
Like a project. And
yeah.
and I think that's what's challenging is, I was that person a lot of the time, shame
Mm-hmm.
on me, shame on how we approached it, where here's this extra thing, like we're checking off this thing on our list. We're going to do performance reviews. So
Yeah.
here's the new process. Hey, thanks. I trained you on it. Goodbye. And that's great. But I had this moment the other day and I was like, you know what? A lot of times people come into organizations and, they take a look at performance reviews, they revamp the performance process, or you have a leader who's like, we really should be doing different performance reviews. And we got to push it back. We got to push back to why. Why? Why? And I think that helped. Like, I think, you know, organizations have cultural values or
Mm-hmm.
values and they leverage those. That's what I want folks to do with trauma informed principles to go, okay, we want to do performance. When you say let's do performance reviews, you're starting with a solution, not the problem.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and we do it all the time because we're like, oh, teams have employee engagement surveys, or they have performance reviews, or they have, career letters. It's like, okay, but why? And I think again, trauma informed culture principles can be a great way to start with why, or if you get an ask, hey, I want to do this thing, let's go back to why and
Mm-hmm.
see how it builds out. And then that way you can be thoughtful about how it supports your journey to be trauma informed, supports your culture that already exists, instead of creating a project, an
Yeah.
extra project that people have to do.
Yeah. What are we trying to accomplish?
Yes.
Either ask why or what. The
Yep.
what is the desired outcome of
Yes.
the intervention, the thing,
Yeah.
and if will it actually get us that, and why do we need it? Engagement's such a perfect
Training
conversation.
is also another one.
Ugh.
Oh, here's this. I knew I was going to get a reaction out of you. Oh, we have this problem. Well, training. I'm like, are we? But wait, there's so many things before that.
Speaking of things that I could talk a long time about, the I need you to come train my team.
Yes.
Oh, 2 people are having fights. I need you to come train everybody on conflict management. No, maybe you need to tell your people what's acceptable to do at work and what's not acceptable.
Mhm.
So I mentioned a panel that you hosted earlier this week, and I know you've got a calendar of those. I would like to make certain we take the opportunity to talk about all of the work that you're doing. Your
Oh, thank you.
writing, your teaching. What all do you have going on right now? What's on your horizon?
Oh, so much. And it's
Mm-hmm.
so exciting. So I like to say that if you like to read, if you like to listen, or you like to watch, I have something for you. So if you are a reader, I have a series of articles that I publish on Medium. And I also, if anyone wants to subscribe, you can go to thewoundedworkforce.com and subscribe there, and you can get those articles directly to your inbox once a week. And I promise not to spam you with anything or sell your information. If you are a listener, and I'm guessing you might be a listener since you're listening to this podcast, I do also host a podcast. It's called Building Trauma Informed Workplaces. Really creative stuff. So I host it. We release an episode every week on Wednesdays. And the episodes are a combination of me talking to you, explaining some of the principles of trauma informed cultures, explaining some items, and some amazing conversations. I just recently had an amazing conversation with Catherine Manning, who actually wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review about why we need trauma informed workplaces. And she is a wealth of knowledge. So check that out. Anywhere podcasts are available, you can subscribe to Building Trauma Informed Workplaces and listen to some great conversations. And last but certainly not least, probably the coolest thing I do is we have right now it is a bi-weekly panel. We'll probably move to a monthly panel in 2024, but it is panel discussions on the principles of trauma-informed workplaces. So we get a group of amazing contributors to come on board and have a conversation about these principles, leverage some of their expertise. Those go live on LinkedIn and on
Mm-hmm.
Facebook. And then if you want to go back and check them out, if you've missed some of them, safety, trust and transparency, community, and now collaboration are all live on our YouTube channel. And then we do have a training coming up November 10th. It is called the Trauma Informed Leader. It is a 90-minute training dedicated to very quickly getting you up to speed on what it means to be a trauma informed leader and how you can take practices back with you, kind of like our choice example. What can you do? What can you take with you to be a more trauma informed leader? And we will be having some additional trainings before the end of the year, more information coming soon, but we're going to have offerings for individuals. So a great way to keep an eye on those is to subscribe or to follow me on LinkedIn. We're going to have some goal setting, trauma-informed goal setting, and we're also going to have a special cohort for folks who want to move past prior workplace trauma, just because that's been something that there's been a massive need for. And then more trainings coming soon in 2024. I also offer bespoke or custom trainings for organizations and teams as well.
You have a lot going on, and I'm
I
very
do. It's
grateful that you
wild.
made time for me today.
Hey, this was so fun.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I
Oh,
really appreciate the opportunity.
the pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'd like to close by referring back to a statistic that Stephanie mentioned. She shared that 70% of adults identify as having experienced trauma. Employers need to pay attention and take action. When we talk about making the workplace trauma informed, we're talking about making work a place where employees are supported and thus able to perform. The question for every leader is, how do I start? Thank you for joining me in the comfy chairs. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating or review, or share it with others. You'll find Comfy Chairs updates and other thoughts on leadership and learning on Instagram at 123 Limited. That's ONE23 LTD. Until next time.